village of Maplewood had always prided itself on its tranquility. Nestled between rolling hills, the small community was a place where nothing ever seemed out of place. It was a world where every neighbor knew every other neighbor's business. Yet there was an unspoken agreement to remain civil and polite, perhaps a little too polite. However, one particularly damp autumn morning, that delicate balance was shattered. Miss Marple, a retired schoolteacher with an impeccable sense for uncovering the smallest details, had been called to the estate of Maplewood House. The sprawling mansion, surrounded by mist and towering oak trees, had stood empty for years, its grandeur slowly decaying as the world passed it by. But on that day, it became the epicenter of a perplexing and dangerous mystery. The crime, when it was discovered, appeared at first to be a trivial accident, but there was nothing accidental about it. The body of Sir Edwin Blackwell, the elderly and reclusive owner of Maplewood House, had been found slumped in his favorite armchair in the library. His tea, still warm, sat on the side table, untouched. Yet, there was something wrong, something that did not sit well with the investigators who arrived on the scene. The room had been locked from the inside with no signs of forced entry. The windows were closed, the doors bolted, and there were no traces of struggle. Sir Edwin's face, once full of pride and suspicion, now looked peaceful, almost serene. But as the investigators inspected the body further, it became clear that this was no simple death. A single silver teaspoon, polished to a high gleam, was lying next to the body, placed deliberately across Sir Edwin's chest. The odd placement of the spoon seemed inconsequential at first, an afterthought in a room full of unanswered questions. Yet something about it seemed deliberate, as if it held some significance. The investigators' minds raced through possible scenarios. Had Sir Edwin been poisoned? Was there a hidden adversary among the few guests who had visited the mansion in recent weeks? Or had he simply died of natural causes, alone and forgotten? No clear answers emerged. The evidence seemed to twist and turn with each new discovery, only deepening the mystery. Detective Sergeant Harris, a young officer with a mind for logic, had been the first to arrive at the scene. He had been summoned by the local constable when the body was discovered. At first, Harris suspected that the crime was a case of foul play, though he could not pinpoint how or why. His experience told him that things were rarely as simple as they appeared on the surface, and this case was no exception. The clue, the teaspoon, nagged at him. Could it be a symbol of something, perhaps a family heirloom or a piece of personal history that was meant to be found? He didn't know, but he was sure the key to solving the case lay within that seemingly insignificant object. His initial investigation brought him no closer to the truth. The staff at Maplewood House had been questioned. They spoke of Sir Edwin's tendency to isolate himself in his library, never leaving the house except for brief trips into town. His only visitors had been a handful of close acquaintances, each of whom had an alibi when the crime occurred. None of them seemed likely suspects. The staff had all been in their quarters, and there was no sign of any unusual activity around the time of death. Everyone had an explanation, and no one had a motive. Harris, frustrated and feeling the pressure mounting, reached out to Miss Marple. Though he had never worked with her directly, he had heard enough about her uncanny ability to solve the unsolvable mysteries that she had become somewhat of a legend. It was a decision he would not soon regret. Miss Marple arrived in Maplewood the very next day, her keen eyes scanning the surroundings with the air of someone who had seen it all before. She immediately noticed the stillness in the house, the way it seemed to suffocate the air. The dust on the bookshelves, The faint smell of must in the corners, the faded curtains. All these details told her that the house had not been lived in for quite some time. She found the atmosphere stifling, and her instincts told her there was more to this than a simple death. "Detective Harris, I trust you've left no stone unturned," she asked, her voice gentle but firm. "Shall we begin?" Harris, eager to have the help of someone with more experience in matters of the mind, led her to the library where Sir Edwin had been found. She stood there for a moment, eyes flicking to the body, then to the spoon on the chest. She turned slowly to the shelves around her, taking in the scene, her thoughts as quiet and still as the room itself. "I believe," she said after a few moments, "that the answer lies not in the obvious, but in the details. Have you considered why the tea was untouched? Surely Sir Edwin would have taken a sip before." She gestured at the body. Harris blinked, unsure of what she meant. "We thought the tea might have been poisoned, but it's still warm, and there's no evidence of any kind of struggle or resistance." "Yes, but have you considered," Miss Marple continued, "the possibility that he was made to drink something else before the tea?" A shift seemed to occur in Harris's mind as he processed her words. The teaspoon, placed so carefully across the body's chest, suddenly seemed more important. He had not yet questioned the staff thoroughly about Sir Edwin's habits. How often had he drunk tea? Had he been a creature of habit, or was there something else about his routine that the staff had overlooked? Miss Marple smiled softly to herself, sensing the breakthrough was near. She had learned long ago that the simplest answer was often the correct one, and in this case, it would be the spoon, the tea, and the hidden secrets of Maplewood House that would unravel the mystery. But first, she would need to learn more about the life of Sir Edwin Blackwell, and about the people who had once been closest to him. Miss Marple's gaze moved slowly across the room, her mind already picking apart the seemingly innocuous details that others had missed. She knew it wasn't enough to rely on the straightforward evidence before her. People often overlooked what was right under their noses. A raised eyebrow, a subtle twitch of the hand, a shift in the air. These were the true signs that something was amiss. She took a slow step closer to the body, bending slightly to inspect the scene with a practiced eye. Harris watched her. His breath held as she seemed to focus on the smallest of details. The library had a quiet elegance, the kind that only existed in old homes where time had slowed to a gentle crawl. The light, filtered through the dusty windows, created long shadows on the polished wood floors. There, beside the armchair where Sir Edwin had been found, was the tea set, a delicate porcelain teapot, the remnants of what had once been a warm brew, and the untouched cup. But Miss Marple's eyes were fixed elsewhere now, scanning the room as if it held the answers she had come to find. "What do you make of the tea, Miss Marple?" Harris asked, still uncertain about the significance. "Do you think it could have been poisoned?" Miss Marple didn't respond immediately, her attention fixed on a small detail by the fireplace. A pair of slippers, clearly out of place, lay discarded at the foot of the hearth. They were elegant, yet they looked as though they had been hurriedly abandoned. Sir Edwin's slippers were nowhere to be seen, yet there was something familiar about these. They were not part of the usual decor of the house, not part of Sir Edwin's habits. "What do you suppose those slippers are doing there, Detective?" she asked, her voice soft but precise. Harris blinked in confusion, following her gaze. "I hadn't noticed them before. They're not Sir Edwin's?" "No," Miss Marple replied, her voice thoughtful. They are not. They don't belong to him at all. I believe they belong to someone who was here with him, someone whose presence in this room may have been overlooked. She took a step closer to the fireplace and crouched down, carefully examining the slippers. They were not old, but they were not new either. A fine, subtle layer of dust had accumulated on them, as though they had been discarded some time ago, yet the shape of the fabric suggested they had been hastily thrown aside. Miss Marple looked up, her sharp gaze locking on Harris. The presence of these slippers is a clue, Detective. Whoever owned them was in a hurry to leave, perhaps even in fear. It's clear they didn't expect to leave in such a fashion. Harris stared at her for a moment, unsure of how to respond. The idea that someone had been in the room with Sir Edwin, someone else who had left in such a hurry, felt like a puzzle piece suddenly falling into place. But if this person had fled, why hadn't the staff noticed? Why hadn't anyone seen them leave? It seemed impossible, yet there it was, a clue as clear as day. "I'll have the staff questioned again, Miss Marple," Harris said, though his voice lacked conviction. "But surely if there had been someone else in the house, we would have noticed." Miss Marple didn't answer him immediately. Instead, she rose to her feet and turned her attention to the bookcase. Her fingers brushed lightly over the spines of the dusty books, her mind running over every possibility. It was a trick she had learned over the years. How to read the atmosphere of a room, how to find the hidden spaces in a person's behavior. Her attention shifted back to the body, focusing now on the clothes Sir Edwin had been wearing. His shirt was slightly askew, as though he had been leaning forward when he collapsed. But it was the tie that caught her eye. Neatly knotted, yet it was unusually tight. Too tight, in fact. It looked as if it had been hastily adjusted, almost as if someone had been in a rush to make him presentable after the fact. "There's something off about the way he's dressed," Miss Marple murmured, almost to herself. "Whoever found him must have tidied him up after death." Harris frowned. "You think someone moved the body?" "It's possible," she said, turning back to him with a thoughtful expression. "But there's more to it than that. Look at the tie, Detective. It's too tight. Whoever arranged him wanted to make sure he looked neat. But there's an urgency about the way it was done." The young detective took a step closer, examining the tie. It was neatly tied, but the knot seemed out of place, not quite as polished as it should have been for someone of Sir Edwin's stature. Harris frowned, realizing Miss Marple was right. He hadn't noticed this small detail before. The more he looked, the clearer it became. Someone had been there before the authorities arrived, and they had been careful to make the scene appear less suspicious than it really was. "I'll have this sent to the lab," Harris said, more to himself than to Miss Marple, as he began to piece the puzzle together in his mind. "But there's still the matter of the staff. They all have alibis, and no one's seen anything strange." Miss Marple glanced at the window, her sharp gaze falling on the slight movement of the curtains. "It's not about what they saw, Detective. It's about what they know, or perhaps what they're hiding." Harris paused, his hand resting on the back of a chair as he tried to understand what she meant. "You think someone is lying?" Miss Marple didn't respond immediately. Instead, she moved to the door, which was slightly ajar. With a measured step, she pushed it open, revealing the hallway beyond. She could hear soft voices from the staff quarters, hushed conversations, but they quickly fell silent when they realized someone was approaching. Miss Marple turned back to Harris, her eyes sharp. "Everyone in this house is hiding something, Detective, and I suspect that the answer lies in what they aren't saying." Harris felt a cold shiver run down his spine. Miss Marple had a way of seeing what others couldn't, and it seemed that she had already uncovered something he hadn't even begun to consider. He felt suddenly aware of how little he knew about the people in this house, and how much they might be keeping from him. The pieces were slowly falling into place, but the truth remained elusive. Miss Marple's steady presence gave him the confidence that the answer was within reach, but the questions were only multiplying. Who had been in the library with Sir Edwin? Why had they left so abruptly? And what had really happened before the tea was served? Harris followed her into the hall, determined to uncover the truth hidden beneath the layers of deceit, while Miss Marple continued to scan the faces around her, her mind working tirelessly to unravel the intricate web of secrets that had been woven so carefully in Maplewood House. The staff of Maplewood House gathered in the dining room, sitting in uneasy silence as Miss Marple and Detective Harris entered. There was a palpable tension in the air, a sense of uncertainty that lingered like the faint scent of damp wood. The faces of the housekeeper, the gardener, and the young maid were all anxious, their eyes flicking nervously between one another as the two investigators moved through the room. Miss Marple took her time, her eyes sweeping over the gathered staff with an intensity that made even the most seasoned of detectives uncomfortable. "Please, take a seat," she said kindly, her voice like a soft command. "We have a few questions for you. It won't take long." The housekeeper, Mrs. Lambert, an elderly woman with tightly drawn features, shifted in her chair. Her hands were folded neatly in her lap, though her knuckles were white from the pressure. She gave a small nod of acknowledgement, but her lips were thin, and her eyes darted toward the others as if searching for an ally. Harris began the questioning, though his approach was more direct than Miss Marple's. "Let's start with you, Mrs. Lambert. You were one of the first to find Sir Edwin, correct?" Mrs. Lambert's voice was steady, but there was a slight tremor in it, a subtle quiver that Harris didn't miss. "Yes, I was. I had gone to check on him in his usual spot, but when I entered the library I found him sitting there, slumped over in his chair. I immediately called for help. Did you notice anything unusual? Any signs that someone might have been with him before you arrived?" Mrs. Lambert's eyes flicked toward the door, and she took a moment before answering. "No, nothing unusual. Just the usual signs of him being in his chair, drinking his tea. Nothing to suggest that anyone had been with him." Harris frowned, but before he could press further, Miss Marple spoke up, her voice gentle but probing. "And you've never seen anyone else in the library? No visitors who came in perhaps after you had last seen Sir Edwin?" The housekeeper's eyes widened slightly, as if the question had caught her off guard. She hesitated before responding, a small, imperceptible shift in her posture. "No, not that I can recall. Sir Edwin was a private man. He didn't have many visitors, not that I knew of." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly, but her expression remained warm. "So you didn't notice anything odd about the slippers near the fireplace?" she asked, her tone nonchalant. Mrs. Lambert's gaze flickered down, and for the first time a flicker of unease passed over her face. "Slippers? I don't know what you're talking about. I didn't see any slippers." The young maid, Elsie, who had been sitting quietly at the end of the table, suddenly spoke up, her voice a little too eager. "I saw them. The slippers, I mean. They were by the fire, but I didn't think much of it at the time." Mrs. Lambert probably didn't see them because she was focused on Sir Edwin. It's easy to overlook things when you're distracted. Harris studied the maid closely. She seemed too quick to speak, too ready to answer. Her eyes were wide and innocent, but something about the way she held herself didn't quite match the innocent words she spoke. Miss Marple, ever observant, seemed to catch it as well. "How long have you worked at Maplewood House, Elsie?" Miss Marple asked, her voice soft but piercing. "Just a few months, ma'am," Elsie replied, her hands wringing nervously in her lap. "I've worked here. Since the summer, I mostly tend to the cleaning and help with meals when needed." "And what of Sir Edwin's habits?" Miss Marple continued. "Did you know him well? Did he ever mention anything unusual to you during the time you worked here?" Elsie shifted uneasily in her seat. "No, nothing like that. He was a very quiet man, never one for conversation. He mostly stayed in his library or went for walks around the grounds. He didn't really talk to anyone much." "You seem to know a lot about his habits," Miss Marple noted, her tone casual but sharp. "Have you spent much time in the library then?" Elsie's eyes widened, but she quickly recovered. "I've cleaned in there a few times, yes. But Sir Edwin never liked anyone disturbing him, so I didn't linger. I always made sure to be quick." Harris glanced at Miss Marple, who gave a barely perceptible nod. The maid's eagerness to answer, her rush to defend her own actions, was beginning to feel rehearsed. Harris had learned to trust his instincts, and his gut told him there was something off about Elsie's responses. "We'll need to question the rest of the staff," Harris said, his voice firm. "But we'll begin with you, Elsie. You say you didn't notice anything unusual when you found the slippers. What about the tea? Sir Edwin had only just poured it before you arrived." Elsie's face paled slightly and she bit her lip. I didn't notice anything strange. I just assumed it was a normal tea. I didn't see the point in asking too many questions." Miss Marple, who had been silently observing the conversation, now spoke, her voice calm but cutting. "You see, Elsie, the problem with your story is that you're too quick to dismiss things. You didn't notice the slippers, yet you somehow knew the tea was normal. Tell me, what was so normal about it?" Elsie opened her mouth to respond, but her words faltered. Her fingers twisted together nervously, and for a moment she seemed to shrink under Miss Marple's gaze. Before Elsie could speak, the gardener, Mr. Hargrave, cleared his throat. "I've been working the grounds all morning," he said, his voice low and steady, but his eyes flicking nervously from one face to the next. "I didn't hear anything unusual, and I didn't see anyone leave the house. I only heard Mrs. Lambert call for help." "Mr. Hargrave," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but insistent. "Did you know Sir Edwin well?" "Not really," he said, shaking his head. "I worked on the grounds, kept to myself mostly. Sir Edwin didn't have much to do with the staff." "Did you ever notice anyone coming and going from the house in recent weeks?" Miss Marple asked. "Anyone who might have had more access than others?" The gardener shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "No, nothing like that. I saw a few guests, but they were never regulars." "Nothing unusual, no?" Miss Marple turned her gaze back to Harris. "I believe we have a start, Detective. Everyone is eager to provide their version of events, but something about their eagerness tells me they are all hiding something." Harris nodded, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. Each person seemed to have a piece of the puzzle, but none of them were offering a full picture. The contradictions were beginning to pile up, small details, things that didn't quite match up. He knew they were getting closer to the truth, but something about this case felt like it was slipping through his fingers. The voices of the staff had been a chorus of confusion and defensiveness, but Miss Marple's presence had already started to unsettle them. They were more careful now, more guarded, and that only added to the suspicion. It was clear to her that one of them, perhaps all of them, were not telling the truth. The real story was hidden somewhere beneath the surface, masked by deception and half-truths. It was only a matter of time before it all came undone, and Miss Marple, with her unshakable confidence, was prepared to wait. She had learned long ago that the smallest of slips, the smallest of contradictions, would always give someone away. The investigation was far from over, but the first seeds of doubt had been sown, and Miss Marple could sense that the truth was, finally, within reach. As the hours passed, the weight of uncertainty grew heavier in Maplewood House. The staff had returned to their duties, but Miss Marple could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Each of them had their own version of the truth, and yet none of the pieces fit together neatly. The contradictions were mounting, and though Harris appeared confident in his questioning, Miss Marple knew the real answer lay not in the facts that were presented, but in the emotions that were being concealed. The puzzle had many pieces, but it was clear to her that each person had a different reason to hide something. Each of them had a motive, but no single theory seemed to explain everything. The more she observed, the more tangled the web of deception became. "Detective," Miss Marple began softly as they left the dining room, "there is something we must consider. Each of these people, Mrs. Lambert, Elsie, and Mr. Hargrave, has a reason to be involved in this tragedy. Greed, jealousy, fear, revenge. They all have something to gain or lose, but none of their stories align." Harris rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "I agree. Every one of them has a possible motive, but there's nothing solid. It feels like a tangle of motives, each one leading us in different directions." Miss Marple nodded, her gaze distant as she continued to mentally sift through the details. "Take Mrs. Lambert, for example. She's been with the family for years, loyal and steady. But loyalty can breed resentment, especially when it's directed at someone like Sir Edwin, a man with the wealth and status she may have always envied. Perhaps she feared that she would be cast aside, forgotten in the wake of his inevitable departure, especially as he had no heirs of his own. But that doesn't explain her behavior when we asked about the slippers," Harris interjected, recalling how Mrs. Lambert had almost recoiled when the subject had come up. "Exactly," Miss Marple continued, her eyes narrowing slightly. "It's as if she feared something would be uncovered. She's hiding something, Detective, but whether it's fear of being discovered or fear of what others might think, we cannot be certain." Harris looked thoughtful, but remained silent, processing her words. The pieces were beginning to fit together, but they didn't form a clear picture just yet. "And then there's Elsie," Miss Marple said, her voice quiet but sure. "Her eagerness to speak, her willingness to explain things in a way that feels rehearsed. It's all too convenient. She didn't just stumble across the slippers or the tea. No, I suspect she's been in that room before." "You think she's involved?" Harris asked, his eyebrows raised. "I do," Miss Marple said with a hint of certainty, "but not in the way you might think. I believe Elsie may have been involved in some way, but not necessarily in a physical sense. She may have had knowledge, perhaps overheard something she shouldn't have. There's a connection between her and Sir Edwin, something not entirely innocent." "Knowledge about what?" Harris pressed. "That is what we need to uncover," Miss Marple replied. "But there is one more person whose motives we cannot overlook, Mr. Hargrave, the gardener. He has been quiet, observant, but there is something in his demeanor that gives me pause." Harris turned to her, puzzled. "Hargrave, what do you suspect?" Miss Marple looked out the window, her eyes scanning the grounds beyond the walls of the house. He may have had a personal interest in Sir Edwin, not necessarily of the romantic kind, but perhaps of the professional. He is, after all, one of the few who has direct access to the land, to the estate. And with that kind of access, one has the power to influence, whether it be through subtle gestures or perhaps through a more direct means. Sir Edwin's will could be a powerful motivator, don't you think? Harris frowned, his gaze flickering back toward the hallway where Mr. Hargrave had been questioned earlier. A financial stake, you mean? Exactly, Miss Marple replied. We cannot ignore the possibility that Mr. Hargrave's motive could have been financial. Perhaps he believed that after Sir Edwin's death he would inherit something substantial. He might have had a falling out with the deceased recently, one that caused him to act out of desperation. Harris sighed deeply, running his hand through his hair. The trouble is, each of them has something to gain. Mrs. Lambert with her years of service, Elsie with her youthful ambition, and Hargrave with his potential financial gain. But we still don't have any concrete evidence to point to any one of them. That's because we're not seeing the bigger picture, Detective, Miss Marple said gently. We need to look at the connections between them. It's not enough to see their motives in isolation. We need to understand how they might have intersected, how they might have worked together, or against each other. Harris looked at her, his face a mixture of frustration and admiration. You think they're all involved in some way? That they're all part of a larger scheme? It's possible, Miss Marple said with a thoughtful pause. But I believe there is one more layer to this story, one more detail that we have missed. Perhaps it lies in the details of Sir Edwin's behavior before his death, or perhaps in the interactions between the staff. But we must examine every conversation, every look, every hint of suspicion, with the same attention to detail that we've applied to the rest of the investigation. They fell silent, both deep in thought. It was clear that Miss Marple's mind was already working, sifting through the clues with precision, drawing connections where others had seen only gaps. Harris, on the other hand, felt the weight of the case pressing down on him. He had relied on facts and evidence up to this point, but Miss Marple was showing him the importance of reading between the lines, of trusting instincts and reading the unspoken words that lingered in the air. The motive was there, hidden beneath layers of fear, jealousy, and desperation. But there was still something missing, something that neither of them had uncovered yet. The staff, with their half-truths and contradictions, had their own stories to tell, but they were not sharing the full story. Miss Marple had a hunch, and it was one that would require more patience, more careful observation to uncover. It wasn't enough to know that the staff had a motive. No, they needed to understand the timing. When did the motives come into play? What was the spark that set this tragedy in motion? The answer, Miss Marple was certain, lay somewhere in the twisted maze of motives that each person carried. Each had a reason, but none of their stories were complete. Not yet. And it was only by drawing them all out, one by one, that the truth would finally begin to reveal itself. The following morning brought a quiet sense of urgency to Maplewood House. The sun rose over the grounds, its pale light casting long shadows through the windows. Miss Marple sat by the fire, sipping her tea, her thoughts still swirling over the tangled motives of the staff. Detective Harris had been up for hours, his mind racing through the same theories, piecing together what they had learned. He was convinced they were on the verge of a breakthrough, and for a moment he allowed himself to believe the case might finally be solved. It was Mr. Hargrave who had provided the clue that had made Harris feel so certain. The gardener had mentioned a conversation he'd overheard between Sir Edwin and Mrs. Lambert several weeks before the murder. According to Hargrave, Sir Edwin had grown agitated when discussing his will, hinting that changes were in the works. Hargrave didn't know the specifics but had seen the housekeeper leave the library on the evening in question, her face flushed and her eyes darting nervously. "I believe this is it, Miss Marple," Harris had said, his voice filled with conviction. "This is the breakthrough we've been waiting for." Miss Marple had listened attentively, but a lingering sense of unease had crept over her. She had no doubt that Hargrave's observation was significant, but there was something about the way the evidence had fallen into place that made her uneasy. It seemed too convenient, too neatly tied together. But her instinct told her to wait, to watch, and to listen a little longer. As Harris gathered the authorities for a formal statement, preparing to make an arrest, Miss Marple could only watch, silently, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. Hargrave had been certain of his observations, and the authorities were now moving forward with confidence. Mrs. Lambert's resentment over Sir Edwin's will, coupled with her nervous behaviour when questioned, had all but sealed her fate. The gardener's testimony had provided the final push toward an arrest, and Harris was quick to label the case closed. "We've got her," Harris had declared earlier, his voice ringing with finality. Mrs. Lambert had the motive, the means, and now the opportunity. We'll bring her in for questioning this afternoon. Miss Marple watched him as he paced the room, running through his conclusions with increasing enthusiasm. He didn't notice the subtle shift in her expression, the doubt that had begun to cloud her thoughts. "Detective," she said softly, her voice breaking into his excited monologue, "I wonder if we might take a moment to consider something. Mrs. Lambert may be guilty, yes, but we are so sure of it, aren't we?" Harris paused, his smile faltering slightly. "Of course we are. The evidence points directly to her. The overheard conversation, her strange reaction to the slippers, it all fits. And I've spoken to a few of the staff members. It's clear. They had their suspicions about her. She's been with the family for years, but who knows what's been festering behind that polite facade." Miss Marple regarded him quietly, her eyes thoughtful. "I know you're eager for answers, but I think we must be careful. It all seems too simple. Everything aligns just a little too perfectly, don't you think? Mrs. Lambert has motive, yes, but so do the others, and the most important clue, the slippers. They've remained unexplained. I'm still not convinced that we're looking at the right person." Harris frowned, irritation creeping into his voice. "Miss Marple, you're always so cautious. This isn't just a theory anymore. We have solid evidence. The slippers, the conversation Hargrave overheard, the missing will. It all adds up. And yet," Miss Marple replied, her voice gentle but firm, "I cannot ignore the feeling that something is amiss. If we arrest Mrs. Lambert now, we may miss the true culprit who's lurking in the shadows, waiting for us to make a mistake." For a moment, Harris said nothing. He looked at Miss Marple, who had become his constant companion in this investigation, her quiet wisdom always a counterbalance to his impulsiveness. He was torn. He wanted to trust her instincts, but the pieces of the puzzle seemed to fit so perfectly now. The breakthrough had arrived, and it felt too right to ignore. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm and measured. "I think, Detective, we need to turn our focus to the staff again. All of them. Hargrave, Elsie, Mrs. Lambert. They all have something to hide, and I fear that the one we choose to arrest might not be the one who deserves it." Harris turned away, running a hand through his hair, conflicted. He knew the case was far from straightforward, but the lead they had was too significant to let go. He sighed, glancing at the door where Mrs. Lambert would soon arrive. "I'll go through the motions, but I have a feeling you're wrong. We've solved this one, Miss Marple." Miss Marple said nothing more. She simply nodded, and though she kept her gaze steady, she couldn't shake the growing sense that this was a false victory. Something about it felt wrong. An hour later, they gathered in the drawing-room. Mrs. Lambert, summoned to the front of the house, appeared composed but tense. She walked in slowly, her face pale, her eyes darting between the men in the room. She took a seat, folding her hands tightly in her lap as Harris presented the evidence. "Mrs. Lambert," he began, his voice firm, "we have gathered enough evidence to believe you played a central role in the death of Sir Edwin. We've discovered your conversation with Mr. Hargrave about his will, the slippers near the fireplace, and your strange reaction when questioned. We believe you murdered Sir Edwin in a fit of rage over his changing will." For the first time, Mrs. Lambert showed a flicker of emotion, surprise, followed by a deep, resigned sigh. "You've been listening to that gossiping fool, haven't you?" she spat, her voice cracking with frustration. "Mr. Hargrave knows nothing about me, and I'll tell you this. He's wrong." Harris raised an eyebrow. "Wrong? How do you explain the rest of the evidence, then?" "I don't know what you think you've found, but I didn't kill Sir Edwin," Mrs. Lambert replied, her voice sharp. "I may have disagreed with some of his decisions, but I never wished him harm." Harris stood rigid, momentarily thrown off by her sudden outburst. Miss Marple observed quietly from the corner of the room, her mind turning over the new development. There was something in Mrs. Lambert's words that struck Miss Marple with a peculiar resonance. The housekeeper was defensive, yes, but not as guilty as her confession seemed to suggest. No, this wasn't how someone with a guilty conscience would behave. Harris paused, looking at Mrs. Lambert with a sense of finality. "Then explain the slippers, the will. We have everything we need to close this case." But Mrs. Lambert didn't answer. Instead, her lips curled into a wry smile. "You think you've solved it, Detective, but you're wrong. The truth is far more complicated than you realize." And as the words hung in the air, Miss Marple's instincts flared. She knew now. Mrs. Lambert's sudden shift in demeanor, her refusal to admit guilt. It was a diversion. She had no intention of confessing because she knew something the others didn't. This was a false victory, a misstep on the part of the authorities, and it was only a matter of time before the real criminal revealed themselves. The case was not over yet. The shadows still held the truth. The room grew heavy with silence as Mrs. Lambert's words hung in the air. Her denial had been sharp, but it lacked the raw panic of someone trying to cover a crime. Harris stood frozen. For a moment, his face tight with frustration, while Miss Marple's mind was already racing ahead, pulling threads from the past that others had left untouched. There was something far deeper here, something buried beneath the surface, and she could feel the weight of it pressing in on her chest. For all the evidence they had, the case wasn't finished. Mrs. Lambert's reaction told her that much. The sharpness in her voice had revealed an unexpected layer. This wasn't the behavior of a woman cornered by guilt. The slipper by the fire had been an important clue, no doubt, but the story surrounding it felt too constructed, too polished to be real. There was a truth buried somewhere, far away from the obvious answers, and Miss Marple knew that if she could find it, everything else would make sense. "Detective," Miss Marple said quietly, pulling Harris's attention back to her. He looked at her, his expression tight. "There's something we're overlooking, something from the past. It's more than just a motive for murder. It's a link between the people involved." Harris frowned, his frustration clear. "Miss Marple, I appreciate your instincts, but we have the evidence. We can't ignore what we know. Mrs. Lambert is the most likely suspect. She had the opportunity, the motive, and the means." "Perhaps," Miss Marple agreed, but her eyes never left Mrs. Lambert. "But let me ask you something. You mentioned that Mrs. Lambert had worked for Sir Edwin for years. What if her role here was far more significant than we initially believed? What if her long service to him had a deeper connection, one that goes back much further?" Harris hesitated, clearly unsettled. "Are you suggesting that Mrs. Lambert is hiding something from her past? That she's not just the housekeeper, but involved in something older, something more personal?" "Exactly," Miss Marple replied. "But I don't think it's just Mrs. Lambert. There's something about the others too. The gardener, Mr. Hargrave. There's a connection between them all. I'm convinced of it." As Harris listened, something in his mind clicked. He had been so focused on the immediate evidence that he had failed to consider the possibility of a deeper, more complicated connection. The history between Sir Edwin and his staff, the power dynamics within the household. There was a tangled web here, and it was only now that Miss Marple was urging him to see it. "Think about it, Harris," Miss Marple continued, her voice soft but insistent. "What we know about Sir Edwin's personal life, his wealth, his loneliness, the lack of heirs, this all played a role in the tensions we're seeing now. And we know that each of the staff members had some kind of relationship with him, either personal or professional. But none of them are acting like they have clean hands." She paused, looking directly at him. "We need to look further back. What was going on here years ago? What were the personal connections between Sir Edwin and the staff before any of this began?" Harris blinked, the sudden shift in focus catching him off guard. He had been so caught up in the present that he had overlooked the fact that this was not just a crime of the now, it had its roots deeply embedded in the past. "Do you think there's a specific event we've missed?" Harris asked, his voice softening. "A connection from the past that would make sense of everything." Miss Marple's gaze sharpened. "I do. In fact, there's something I remember about Sir Edwin's history that might explain it all." She leaned forward, her fingers wrapped around her teacup. "It's an old story, one that was whispered in the halls of this house long ago. Sir Edwin, before he became the recluse he was in his later years, was once very close to a young woman, a woman who worked here at Maplewood. She was an ambitious girl, bright, eager to rise in the world. Her name was Eleanor Green. I believe she was the niece of one of the earlier servants here. Her ambitions, however, led her to cross paths with Sir Edwin in a very unfortunate way." Harris raised an eyebrow. "And what happened?" Miss Marple's voice dropped to a near whisper. "Eleanor and Sir Edwin had an affair, one that caused a scandal years ago. Her family wasn't happy about it, and neither was the rest of the staff. The scandal nearly ruined Sir Edwin's reputation, and Eleanor's career here was abruptly ended. No one knew exactly what happened after that, but she left Maplewood in disgrace. But the most important part of the story is what happened next, what came from her disappearance." Harris's mind raced, the pieces of the puzzle slowly coming together in his mind. He was beginning to see the connections Miss Marple was drawing. You think the affair between Sir Edwin and Eleanor Green is related to this murder? I do, Miss Marple said softly, and I think it's a part of the reason we're seeing so much animosity between the staff members. Eleanor Green had a child, a daughter. Her name was Amelia, and it's my belief that she's the key to all of this. The daughter of the woman who had an affair with Sir Edwin. Harris's voice dropped as he understood. But what does that have to do with the staff here? Miss Marple's eyes gleamed with understanding. The daughter, Amelia, would have been around the age to work here when Sir Edwin started to make his changes. She would have known the house and the people within it, and she might have even been hired by Sir Edwin under another name, perhaps even without the staff realizing her true identity. Amelia's arrival would explain the tension, especially if she had inherited some of her mother's unresolved grievances. If the staff believed that Sir Edwin's past actions were being repeated, they might have seen her as a threat that needed to be silenced. But why would Hargrave and Mrs. Lambert be involved? Harris asked, still piecing the story together. Because, Miss Marple said, her voice steady, they had been here long enough to remember the past. They knew exactly who Amelia was, and they knew the history that came with her mother. And if Amelia had returned to settle old scores, if she had returned with the intent to confront Sir Edwin about his past treatment of her mother, then perhaps someone here felt that they had to stop her. A shiver ran down Harris's spine. So you think Amelia Green might be the one who killed Sir Edwin? Miss Marple nodded slowly. I do. But there's something more to this than just revenge. I suspect that Amelia might not have acted alone. There's a strong possibility that someone else in the household was protecting her, someone who had their own reasons for keeping her identity hidden. The story, once seemingly clear-cut, was now filled with shadows. Amelia Green, a figure lost to history, had re-emerged, and her presence had unearthed old secrets, secrets that connected the past to the present in ways no one could have foreseen. Sir Edwin's legacy was more tangled than anyone had imagined, and the truth about who killed him had roots buried far deeper than any of them had guessed. As Miss Marple sat back, she realized that the most dangerous part of the puzzle was just beginning to reveal itself. The atmosphere at Maplewood House had shifted. What had once been a house filled with suspicion now carried an undercurrent of tension that felt more palpable than before. Everyone seemed to be on edge, particularly with Miss Marple's revelations. Amelia Green's unexpected re-emergence, linked to an affair long buried, had shaken the staff. Yet the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more she realized that uncovering the identity of the murderer would not come easily. There was still too much uncertainty, too many variables to consider. She needed to see if she could provoke a reaction from the suspects, something that would help expose the cracks in their carefully constructed stories. It was Harris who had suggested, in a moment of frustration, that perhaps a more psychological approach might uncover the final piece. He had been throwing out ideas in the drawing room when Miss Marple, quietly observing the staff's interactions, had an epiphany. Perhaps it wasn't a matter of getting the suspects to tell the truth. Perhaps it was about watching them crack under pressure. They needed to be pushed, but in a way that didn't appear overt, that didn't force their hands too quickly. The answers, Miss Marple believed, lay within their reactions, not just their words. I think it's time for a different kind of test, Miss Marple had said to Harris, who had looked at her curiously. A test of character, if you will. Harris, ever the skeptic, had raised an eyebrow. What do you mean, Miss Marple? We've questioned everyone already. We've gathered the evidence. Why not just go ahead and arrest Mrs. Lambert? Miss Marple, in her quiet way, had smiled. Not yet, detective. Sometimes the truth is in the unspoken moments. We'll let them think they've been dismissed, and then, when they least expect it, we'll see what happens. The plan was simple. Miss Marple had requested a private meeting with each of the suspects. The official questioning was over for now, but she knew that subtlety would be key. She needed to see how they reacted when they thought no one was watching. It was not the interrogation that mattered. It was the silence between the words, the small lapses in control that would reveal more than a confession ever could. The first to arrive in the parlour was Mr. Hargrave, the gardener. His rugged demeanour and stoic nature had led Harris to trust him, but Miss Marple knew that he might be more involved in this than anyone had suspected. Hargrave, she noticed, had not once made eye contact with her since the conversation had shifted toward the past. The way he fidgeted with his gloves, an uncharacteristic display of nerves, told Miss Marple that he was either hiding something or trying very hard to suppress it. "Mr. Hargrave, please sit," Miss Marple said, her voice soft and inviting. "I won't keep you long. I've been thinking about your testimony, about what you told us regarding Sir Edwin's will. You mentioned overhearing a conversation, but I'm curious. When exactly was it that you heard them talking?" Hargrave shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "It was just before Sir Edwin died, ma'am. Couple of weeks before, maybe a little more. Hard to say. I wasn't exactly listening, you know, but I heard them arguing in the library, Sir Edwin and Mrs. Lambert." Miss Marple nodded, keeping her expression neutral. "And you didn't hear anything else? No mention of anything else that might have been said in the heat of the moment? Maybe a name or a phrase that stood out?" Hargrave hesitated. "No, ma'am. It was just their voices raised. I didn't think it was my place to meddle." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed slightly as she observed his shift in posture. There was a subtle tightening around his jaw, a slight tremble in his hands as he adjusted his gloves. Hargrave was hiding something. He wasn't just the concerned gardener he appeared to be. He was trying to keep something hidden, something that wasn't in his initial statement. "Mr. Hargrave," Miss Marple continued, her voice becoming softer, "you've been so helpful, but I wonder if you're withholding something. Do you know about Sir Edwin's relationship with a woman named Eleanor Green? A woman who once worked here, some years ago?" Hargrave stiffened, the colour draining from his face. For a moment, it was as though the world around them had stopped moving. Hargrave's reaction was swift. A quick glance away, a shift in his seat, followed by a long silence. I don't know what you mean, ma'am," he muttered, his voice strained. "I've heard the name, but I don't know anything about her." But Miss Marple had already seen it. The crack in his armour, the guilt, or perhaps the fear, that had leaked through for the briefest of moments. He had known more about Eleanor Green than he was willing to admit. Hargrave was hiding something, and this wasn't the time for him to play the innocent bystander. Miss Marple stood, the soft creak of the floorboards sounding louder than ever. "I think we both know, Mr. Hargrave, that you've heard more about Eleanor Green than you've let on. I've noticed the way you react to certain names. There's more to your relationship with Sir Edwin than you've told us." Hargrave's eyes flickered toward the door, his escape route. Miss Marple didn't allow him the satisfaction of turning away. She stepped forward slowly, the silence between them thick with unsaid words. The subtle manipulation in her voice was deliberate, calculated. Hargrave shifted in his seat again, clearly uncomfortable under her unblinking gaze. I didn't mean to offend, ma'am, but it's not my place to say any more. You'll understand when the time comes." His voice was barely a whisper now, strained with what could only be described as a mixture of guilt and fear. "Time," Miss Marple echoed, her eyes sharp. "What time, Mr. Hargrave?" Before he could respond, the door creaked open, and the next suspect stepped into the room, Mrs. Lambert. Her expression was tight, and she was no longer the calm, composed housekeeper she had been during the formal questioning. Her eyes darted nervously between the two people in the room, and when she caught Miss Marple's steady gaze, she seemed to shrink back almost imperceptibly. Miss Marple allowed her gaze to rest on Mrs. Lambert for a moment longer before turning her attention back to Hargrave. "I believe you've already said all that you're going to say, Mr. Hargrave," she said quietly, "but I'll be speaking to the others now. I do hope you'll reconsider your position on Eleanor Green." Hargrave didn't respond. He simply stood and left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. The tension in the room was palpable, but Miss Marple could see that Hargrave's facade had begun to crack. Whatever he was hiding, it was not something he could keep buried for much longer. His reaction had told her all she needed to know. Now, with Mrs. Lambert seated before her, Miss Marple knew she was about to push for the truth again, but this time with Hargrave's reaction fresh in her mind. It was time to test her, to see if Mrs. Lambert would reveal her own cracks. "I'd like to speak with you alone now, Mrs. Lambert," Miss Marple said softly. "There's something I need to ask you, something that's been bothering me." Miss Marple sat quietly, watching Mrs. Lambert as she settled herself into the chair across from her, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The woman's nervous energy was palpable, but Miss Marple was careful not to rush her. She had learned over the years that pushing too hard only caused people to close off further. Instead, she let the silence stretch, allowing Mrs. Lambert to feel the weight of her presence. The housekeeper's eyes flickered toward the door, and Miss Marple noticed the subtle shift in her posture, a slight tightening of her shoulders, a faintly defensive tilt of her head. Mrs. Lambert was trying to maintain control, but something about the conversation was unnerving her. It was in the way she looked away whenever Miss Marple's gaze lingered too long, or the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke. "I've been thinking about something, Mrs. Lambert," Miss Marple said, at last breaking the silence. "Earlier you told us you were in the kitchen when Sir Edwin was murdered, but that seems, well, rather convenient, don't you think?" Mrs. Lambert's eyes widened slightly. "I don't know what you mean, ma'am. I was in the kitchen. I've told you that already." "Yes, you have," Miss Marple replied softly. "But there's something else, isn't there? Something you've left out. Perhaps something you didn't think would matter at the time, but now it does." The housekeeper's lips pressed into a thin line. She didn't respond immediately, and Miss Marple knew that this was the moment when the faintest glimmer of hesitation began to show. It was as though Mrs. Lambert was carefully considering how much of the truth she should reveal, or whether she could afford to hold back just a little longer. Just as Mrs. Lambert opened her mouth to speak, the door to the parlour swung open abruptly, interrupting the moment. Harris stood in the doorway, his face taut with frustration. He didn't wait for an invitation before stepping into the room, his expression unreadable. "I'm sorry, Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight. "We've got a problem." Miss Marple raised an eyebrow, glancing between Harris and Mrs. Lambert. "What is it?" "The file," Harris said, his voice low. The one with all the evidence we've gathered, notes, statements, photographs. It's gone, completely disappeared. For a moment, time seemed to slow. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she absorbed the weight of his words. Gone? How could it be gone? Impossible, Miss Marple murmured, her mind racing. Are you certain? Harris ran a hand through his hair in frustration. We checked the office twice. It's not there. We had it just this morning. The only thing we can think of is that someone took it. Mrs. Lambert shifted in her seat, her face an unreadable mask. Miss Marple's gaze flicked toward her, noting the tightness in her jaw and the way she refused to meet her eyes. Someone took it, Miss Marple repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. But who would do such a thing, and why? Harris looked down at the floor, his jaw clenched. I don't know. But someone's trying to cover their tracks. We need to find out who, before they can do any more damage. Yes, Miss Marple said slowly. But more importantly, we need to figure out why. Who is trying to stop us from finding the truth? And what are they hiding? The implications were clear now. Someone in this very house, had taken the file, the key piece of evidence that had been gathered over the course of the investigation. It wasn't just a coincidence. It wasn't an accident. Someone was deliberately trying to bury the truth, to stop the investigation in its tracks. As Harris stormed out of the room to continue his search, Miss Marple remained seated, her mind working furiously. The theft of the evidence was no random act. Whoever had taken it knew the importance of the documents, knew that they could tie everything together. But what was it that they were trying to hide? Her gaze shifted back to Mrs. Lambert, who seemed to be watching her closely. The housekeeper's hands had now folded tightly in her lap, and she was looking anywhere but directly at Miss Marple. It was subtle, so subtle that most people wouldn't have noticed, but Miss Marple could see it clearly. Mrs. Lambert was reacting, and not in the way someone with nothing to hide would. I wonder, Miss Marple said, her voice casual but carefully chosen, if you know anything about the missing file, Mrs. Lambert. The housekeeper's eyes flickered toward her, and for the briefest moment Miss Marple saw something in them, fear, or maybe guilt, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. I don't know anything about that, Mrs. Lambert said, her voice tight. I'm sure it's just a mistake, ma'am. These things happen. Miss Marple observed her closely. She wasn't quite sure what Mrs. Lambert was hiding, but the unease in her demeanor couldn't be ignored. There was something there, something that didn't add up. But for now, there was nothing Miss Marple could do but wait. The thief had made their move, and the game had just become far more dangerous. The investigation had taken an unexpected turn. The stakes had risen, and now, more than ever, Miss Marple knew she needed to be vigilant. The truth was still out, there, buried beneath layers of deception, but someone in this house was desperate to keep it hidden. She needed to find out who and why before it was too late. Just as Miss Marple was about to rise and begin her own search, the door opened again, and Harris returned, his face pale. He was holding something in his hand, an old, crumpled envelope. I found this in the study, he said, his voice strained. It was tucked behind a shelf, almost hidden from view. I thought it might be important. Miss Marple took the envelope from him, her fingers brushing against the worn paper. As she carefully opened it, she found a letter inside, one that had clearly been read many times, its edges frayed and torn. The letter was addressed to Sir Edwin, and as Miss Marple read its contents, a chill ran down her spine. It wasn't just a letter. It was a confession of a crime, one that linked the past to the present in ways no one had expected. And just like that, the pieces began to fall into place. The stolen file was a diversion, a calculated move to keep the letter from being discovered. Whoever had taken the evidence had underestimated Miss Marple's ability to find the truth. And now, the final link had been made. She looked up at Harris, her eyes steely. It's time to confront the person behind this. The truth is finally coming to light. Miss Marple's pulse quickened as she stared at the confession letter, the weight of the discovery settling over her. Harris, still standing by the door, waited for her to speak, but she remained silent, lost in thought. The confession wasn't just a clue. It was a key that unlocked a deeper mystery, one that tied everything together. But as she turned the letter over in her hands, a sudden realization gripped her. The final answer was still elusive. There was something about this letter, something in the way it had been hidden, that felt wrong. Before she could voice her thoughts, the house was rocked by a sudden sharp sound, a scream followed by the unmistakable crash of glass shattering. Without a word, Miss Marple stood, her heart hammering in her chest. She moved swiftly toward the source of the disturbance, her mind racing. The scream had come from the direction of the library. She was certain of it. Harris followed at her heels, his expression tense and pale, but Miss Marple's mind was already several steps ahead, piecing together the fragments of the puzzle. As they entered the library, the scene before them was chaotic. A large window had been shattered, its jagged glass littering the floor. But it wasn't the window that caught Miss Marple's attention. It was the figure slumped on the floor, a figure she instantly recognized. It was Mrs. Lambert, her face ashen, her breath shallow, her eyes wide in terror. Mrs. Lambert. Harris rushed forward, kneeling beside the housekeeper. Miss Marple watched carefully, noting the woman's trembling hands, the faint, almost imperceptible tremor in her lip. But there was something else, a glint of fear in her eyes, and a strange sense of familiarity that Miss Marple couldn't quite place. The housekeeper's eyes flickered toward the shattered window, and then, in a hoarse whisper, she spoke. He's coming. He won't stop." Harris, not fully understanding, tried to calm her down. "Who?" "Mrs. Lambert. Who did this?" But she didn't respond. Instead, her eyes closed briefly, and when they opened again, they were filled with an almost resigned dread. He knows everything." "Who knows everything?" Miss Marple asked quietly, moving closer, her voice cutting through the frantic atmosphere like a blade. Mrs. Lambert took in a deep breath, then whispered, just loud enough for Miss Marple to hear. "The man who killed Sir Edwin. He's still here. He's still watching." Harris stood up abruptly, a look of confusion clouding his features. "What are you talking about? Sir Edwin's killer is dead. We know that for sure." But Miss Marple, her mind already working in overdrive, didn't respond to Harris's confusion. She was focused entirely on Mrs. Lambert, on the woman's words. The killer is still here. Could it be possible? Had they made a mistake in assuming the case was closed? No, it didn't fit. If the murderer was still at large, why hadn't they made a move sooner? Why hadn't they struck when the investigation had been at its height? But before Miss Marple could form any conclusions, the room was suddenly plunged into darkness. The lights flickered and died, leaving only the dim light from the distant hallway to cast shadows across the room. Miss Marple's eyes narrowed and her senses heightened. This wasn't an accident. Someone had deliberately cut the power. Moment later, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow, deliberate, and heavy with intent. Harris stepped forward, his voice low and tense. "Who's there?" he demanded, his hand reaching for his pistol. But there was no response. Instead, the footsteps grew louder, closer, until they stopped just outside the library door. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. She could feel the tension in the air, the suffocating pressure that only came when danger was imminent. The door creaked open slowly, and in the darkness, Miss Marple could make out a figure standing in the doorway. It was tall, cloaked in shadow, its outline obscured by the dim light, but Miss Marple didn't need to see the person's face to recognize the danger. She had seen enough to know that whoever was on the other side of that door wasn't there to talk. Before anyone could react, the figure lunged forward, a knife glinting in the faint light. Miss Marple moved instinctively, stepping aside just as the blade sliced through the air where she had been standing moments before. Harris shouted, raising his gun, but the figure was fast, too fast. The shadowed assailant twisted and ducked, using the room's dark corners to their advantage. Miss Marple's mind raced. She could feel the pressure mounting, the sense that the killer had been waiting for this moment, for the perfect opportunity to strike again. But this wasn't just about silencing one person anymore. No, it was something much larger, much more dangerous. The killer was after them all, after the truth. "Run!" Miss Marple shouted to Harris, her voice sharp. "Get to the others, lock the doors." Harris hesitated, unsure whether to leave her behind, but Miss Marple's gaze was unflinching, her voice firm. He knew she wouldn't let herself be caught off guard. As he raced toward the hallway, Miss Marple moved to the opposite side of the room, her eyes scanning for any sign of the assailant. The figure had disappeared into the shadows again, but Miss Marple had a trick up her sleeve, something the murderer hadn't accounted for. Her mind flashed back to the letter, to the pieces of the puzzle she had only just started to fit together. She couldn't afford to let this killer escape. Not now, not when they were so close. A noise in the corner caught her attention. The assailant had moved again, but this time they made a fatal mistake. They had underestimated her. With a swift movement, Miss Marple dropped to the floor, sliding beneath the nearby table and using the shadows to her advantage. The figure's footsteps slowed, the tension building again, and just as the assailant moved into range, Miss Marple struck, her hands grabbing hold of the assailant's wrist and twisting violently, knocking the knife from their hand. For a split second, everything froze. Then the figure let out a strangled cry, and with a sudden burst of force, they wrenched themselves free, stumbling back into the darkness. Miss Marple, though, was ready. She knew they couldn't get away. Not this time. Before the assailant could react, she reached for her phone and pressed the emergency call button. Her eyes never left the doorway as she waited for the sound of sirens to signal the arrival of backup. The villain had made their move, but Miss Marple was one step ahead. The sirens wailed in the distance, but Miss Marple's thoughts remained focused, methodical. As the seconds passed, she remained crouched in the shadows, her eyes never leaving the place where the assailant had vanished. The adrenaline from the confrontation was still coursing through her veins, but it was already fading, replaced by the familiar calm of calculation. This wasn't over. Far from it. She rose slowly, her posture unhurried but poised for action. The momentary chaos had settled into a quieter rhythm, And now, in the calm after the storm, Miss Marple's mind could think clearly. The figure had fled, but it had made a crucial mistake. The knife left behind was a key, the very same weapon the killer had used before, the one that had cut Sir Edwin down. But it wasn't just about the weapon. It was the attack itself. There was something so hurried, so desperate about it, almost as if the killer wasn't expecting to be discovered, as though they had acted in the heat of the moment, not part of a well-laid plan. And then there was the matter of the housekeeper. Mrs. Lambert's whispered words echoed in Miss Marple's mind. He's coming. He won't stop. She had said more than she realized, but it was that subtle fear in her voice that revealed the deeper truth, the fear of someone from her past, someone who had been hiding in plain sight. But what had Mrs. Lambert meant when she mentioned, "He knows everything"? Miss Marple stood still for a moment, recalling all the conversations, all the small details that had seemed so insignificant before. She thought back to the first time Mrs. Lambert had appeared in the investigation, nervous, fidgeting, refusing to meet her eyes when questioned about the events surrounding Sir Edwin's death. The housekeeper had been too eager to provide the authorities with information about Sir Edwin's personal life, but there had always been something that didn't quite add up. That same unease had followed her during the questioning of the other suspects, a discomfort that seemed to pervade everything Mrs. Lambert did, like a thread running through the tapestry of deception. And it all circled back to the same question. What was she hiding? The answer, Miss Marple realized with a sudden clarity, had been in plain sight all along. The housekeeper wasn't merely an observer in this drama, she was part of it. The lies, the misplaced stories, the inconsistencies, it all pointed back to one thing. Mrs. Lambert had a connection to the crime that went far deeper than anyone had suspected. Miss Marple's eyes snapped to the bookshelf across the room. A small detail from earlier, something she had overlooked, suddenly stood out. There, on the far left shelf, a book was slightly out of place. It was a volume of poems by an obscure author, its spine turned outward as though it had been hastily replaced. She had noticed it when she first entered the room, but hadn't thought anything of it. Now, with the realization crystallizing in her mind, she stepped forward and pulled the book from the shelf. A hollow sound came from within. She pried the back cover open and found a small envelope tucked neatly inside. Her fingers brushed the edge of the paper, and for a moment she felt the weight of something significant. This wasn't just any letter. The handwriting inside was familiar. She recognized it immediately. It was Mrs. Lambert's. The letter contained nothing extraordinary, just a few lines written in an elegant, almost too perfect script. "It's done. He can't stop us now. The others will be dealt with in time, but tonight is the beginning. You have to keep your promises. He'll know we were in it together." It was a strange, cryptic message, but one that tied everything together with chilling precision. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat as she understood what it meant. Mrs. Lambert had known all along. She was part of this intricate web, perhaps even the mastermind behind it. The next piece of the puzzle fell into place as Miss Marple recalled the dinner that had preceded Sir Edwin's death. Mrs. Lambert had been particularly attentive that evening, constantly ensuring that the guests were comfortable, but one guest had stood out in her mind, the one who had behaved differently than the others, not quite as nervous, not quite as eager to please. It had been Geoffrey Merton, the lawyer. He had maintained a calm, almost detached air, yet he was one of the first to rush to the scene of the crime. Miss Marple had found his reaction odd at the time. but now it made sense. He was too eager to step into the role of the hero, to take control of the situation when others might have hesitated. Now, with the letter in her hand, it was clear. Geoffrey Merton and Mrs. Lambert were in it together. But why? What had they been working toward? A soft knock at the door interrupted her thoughts, and Miss Marple turned just in time to see Harris re-enter, followed by 2 officers from the local constabulary. Their presence brought no immediate answers, but their arrival provided a much-needed buffer to the tension that had filled the room since the earlier confrontation. Harris looked agitated, his eyes darting between the room's scattered pieces of evidence, his mind clearly at work. "Miss Marple," he said, his voice tight, "I thought you might want to see this." He handed her a folder containing a series of photographs and documents. She leafed through them quickly, recognizing Sir Edwin's will among the papers. It was the same document that had been mentioned before, the one that had caused so much strife between the family members. As Miss Marple skimmed the pages, one detail stood out. A clause that bequeathed a large sum of money to the local orphanage, but only on the condition that the estate's financial affairs were handled by Geoffrey Merton. The puzzle pieces slid together. The lawyer had been working with Mrs. Lambert to ensure that Sir Edwin's death would benefit them both. Mrs. Lambert had orchestrated the chaos, while Merton had been positioning himself to take control of the estate. Miss Marple closed the folder, her mind now certain of the truth. She had solved the riddle. The key to the murder wasn't just greed or revenge. It was a well-laid scheme, decades in the making. And now, the killer would stop at nothing to protect what they had gained. "Get the others," Miss Marple said quietly, her voice carrying the weight of finality. "I think it's time we finished this." The pattern had emerged, clear and unyielding. The game was over. The killer was trapped, and it was only a matter of time before they were caught. The room was eerily quiet, as Miss Marple waited for the others to return. The evidence she had found, particularly the letter, had confirmed her suspicions. Geoffrey Merton and Mrs. Lambert had orchestrated a tangled web of deception, but it was more than just a matter of greed or power. They had wanted to control Sir Edwin's fortune, yes, but there was something far darker lurking beneath the surface. She felt it in her bones. The letter she had discovered revealed an unsettling level of trust between the 2 conspirators, but what remained unclear was why they had taken such drastic measures. Why had they killed Sir Edwin? Why had they involved themselves in such a risky plot when the consequences seemed so dire? She thought back to her earlier conversations with the suspects, particularly Mrs. Lambert. Beneath her anxious manner and polite demeanour, there had been moments when her eyes betrayed something else, a deep-seated fear. At first, Miss Marple had assumed it was the fear of being caught in the act, but now she saw it for what it truly was, the fear of something far more personal, something that connected her to Sir Edwin in ways no one had realised. Miss Marple's mind turned to the town's history, to the people who had lived in Maplewood House long before the present generation. She had heard whispers of Sir Edwin's youth, of his turbulent relationships with his family, and of the family secrets that had remained buried for decades. Sir Edwin had always been distant, cold even, but she now suspected that there had been more to that aloofness than anyone had imagined. The motives of revenge and financial gain were distractions, thin veils over the real reason behind the murder. Miss Marple's gaze flickered to the papers Harris had left her. The will was clear. Sir Edwin had left vast sums of money to various organisations and charities, But his personal estate was slated to pass into the hands of a man he had trusted, Geoffrey Merton. But why had Sir Edwin entrusted a man with his fortune who had no personal connection to him? Why had the lawyer been so eager to control the financial matters of the estate? It didn't sit right. Her eyes narrowed as she recalled a conversation with Mrs. Lambert during one of the earlier interviews. It had been subtle, almost too casual, but it had struck her as odd at the time. Mrs. Lambert had mentioned that she had worked for Sir Edwin's father, not just as a housekeeper, but in a capacity that she was hesitant to discuss further. She had avoided the topic entirely when asked to elaborate, and Miss Marple had let it go. But now, with the new understanding of the situation, it became glaringly clear. Sir Edwin's father had been a cruel, controlling man, one who had hidden many secrets. His relationship with his staff, particularly Mrs. Lambert, had been rumoured to be far more complicated than it appeared on the surface. It wasn't just about money, it was about legacy, control, and a buried secret that had finally come to light. Suddenly, Miss Marple understood. The true motive wasn't power, it was retribution. Mrs. Lambert and Geoffrey Merton hadn't just killed Sir Edwin for financial gain, they had killed him to protect a secret so horrific that its revelation would have destroyed everything. Mrs. Lambert had known that Sir Edwin would eventually discover the truth about his father's past, about what had really happened years ago in that very house, and she, along with Merton, had killed to keep that truth buried. Sir Edwin's father had been involved in a scandalous affair, one that had been hidden from the public eye for years. Mrs. Lambert had been an unwilling participant in that affair, an affair that had resulted in the birth of a child Sir Edwin never knew about. The child had been taken from the house, hidden away in an orphanage, and Mrs. Lambert had been forced to silence her guilt. She had spent her life trying to erase any trace of the scandal, even as Sir Edwin unknowingly had carried on his father's legacy of secrets. The shock of the revelation made Miss Marple's pulse quicken. Mrs. Lambert and Merton had worked together not just to ensure the inheritance passed into the right hands, but to cover up a dark, buried truth. Sir Edwin had been poised to uncover the true nature of his family, to expose the illegitimate child of his father. The knowledge of this truth would have not only ruined his name, but also implicated his late father in a scandal that could never be undone. So they had killed him before he could dig deeper. The realization hit like a thunderclap. The murder was far from an isolated act of violence. It was part of a larger plan, a plan to erase a chapter in the family's history that had always been kept hidden. Mrs. Lambert and Merton weren't merely trying to secure money. They were trying to protect themselves from a devastating truth that threatened to destroy their lives. But even now, the true horror of the crime was not fully exposed. Miss Marple knew that the murderer's psychology was even more complicated than anyone had realized. Mrs. Lambert had carried a lifetime of guilt, and it had driven her to extreme measures, even to the point of partnering with Geoffrey Merton, a man whose ambition had outstripped his morals. They had been willing to kill for a secret that, in the grand scheme of things, might have been better left buried. As the pieces fell into place, Miss Marple knew that the final confrontation was inevitable. The web of deceit had grown too large, too intricate, and now the people involved were desperate to protect themselves. Mrs. Lambert, with her quiet dignity, had spent years hiding the truth, but now that truth would come to light. Geoffrey Merton, ever the opportunist, would stop at nothing to ensure his own survival, even if it meant silencing anyone who threatened to expose the past. Miss Marple took one last look at the room, her mind moving faster than her body could react. The truth was out. The killer's motives were finally revealed. But in a twisted way, Miss Marple thought, the real tragedy wasn't just in the death of Sir Edwin. It was in the deep-rooted secrets that had festered in this house for so long. And now, the final pieces of the puzzle were about to fall into place, bringing the killer's twisted psychology to a bitter, inevitable conclusion. The past had finally caught up with the present, and justice would soon follow. Miss Marple stood in the quiet of Maplewood House, her sharp eyes never leaving the two suspects in the room with her, Geoffrey Merton and Mrs. Lambert. The evening had fallen, casting long shadows across the room, and the air was thick with an almost palpable tension. The walls, which had once echoed with the sounds of laughter and life, now stood as silent witnesses to the final act in this tragic drama. She had known for some time that she had finally unravelled the twisted truth behind Sir Edwin's murder. The last pieces had fallen into place after that quiet conversation with Mrs. Lambert, when the older woman's carefully controlled facade had slipped ever so slightly, revealing the raw fear beneath. It was fear of the past catching up with her, fear that no matter how much she had buried the truth, the world might soon learn of the scandal that had haunted her for decades. But now, as the final confrontation loomed, Miss Marple knew she needed to set the perfect trap. She had already arranged everything, carefully orchestrating the next steps. All that was left was to draw the suspects into her web. She turned her gaze to Geoffrey Merton, who sat across the room with his arms crossed, a barely concealed scowl on his face. He had been the one to push for Sir Edwin's swift burial, eager to secure the inheritance. But it was Mrs. Lambert who had been the mastermind, hiding the deepest secrets. It had been Mrs. Lambert who had orchestrated the murder, and Merton had simply been her accomplice, convinced by promises of wealth and power. But it wasn't just money. It was far more than that. Both Merton and Mrs. Lambert had been trying to protect themselves from the consequences of a truth that was far worse than anyone could have imagined. The story of Sir Edwin's father's affair, of the illegitimate child, of a past that refused to remain buried, was one that would have destroyed them both. And now, it was time for that truth to come to light. Miss Marple had quietly arranged for the police to gather in the next room. She had asked them to remain out of sight for now, so that when the time came, they would be ready. But the true confrontation had to take place now, between her and the two conspirators. She was in complete control, even if they didn't yet realize it. She stepped toward the center of the room, her voice calm but firm. "I've had time to think, you know, and I've come to a very unsettling conclusion. You, Mrs. Lambert, and you, Mr. Merton, both had something to gain from Sir Edwin's death." Geoffrey Merton's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Mrs. Lambert's hands trembled slightly in her lap, her knuckles pale from gripping the fabric of her dress. Neither one was willing to admit anything, but Miss Marple could sense their unease. "I believe," Miss Marple continued, "that Sir Edwin was close to discovering the truth about his father's past, about the affair that led to the birth of the child, an affair that no one in this town dared speak of. Mrs. Lambert, you've spent decades hiding the truth, haven't you? Trying to erase the memory of what happened between you and Sir Edwin's father." Mrs. Lambert flinched, her eyes flickering toward the door as though considering running. But she was trapped. Miss Marple had made sure of that. She had orchestrated this moment perfectly. "I know it must be difficult," Miss Marple added with a soft sigh, as if sympathizing with the older woman. "Carrying that burden for so long. But your secret, your guilt, it was starting to unravel. Sir Edwin was going to find out, wasn't he? He was going to expose the truth about his father's betrayal, and that would have ruined everything you've worked for, so you killed him. Mrs. Lambert's breath hitched, and for the briefest moment Miss Marple saw a flicker of panic in her eyes. But she didn't speak. Miss Marple turned her gaze to Merton, her voice steady as she continued. "And you, Mr. Merton. You thought you could help her cover it up, didn't you? You were blinded by your greed. You saw an opportunity for yourself in Sir Edwin's death, and you didn't hesitate to take it. You helped Mrs. Lambert plan the murder, and you both worked together to make sure it looked like an accident. But it wasn't, was it?" Merton's jaw clenched, his face growing red as he fought to maintain control. Miss Marple's words had struck a chord, but he still refused to give in. "You're wrong," he spat, his voice harsh. "You have no proof." Miss Marple allowed a small, knowing smile to cross her lips. "Don't I? You see, Mr. Merton, the proof is all around you. The letter from Sir Edwin, the missing piece of the will, your own statements, which have been inconsistent from the start. But most importantly, the one thing you overlooked, the one thing you didn't count on, was me." With that, she nodded to the corner of the room, where Detective Harris stepped forward, his face stern. Mrs. Lambert's eyes widened in shock as she saw the officer, and for the first time, Merton's composure cracked. He knew what was coming. "The game was up. You both thought you had gotten away with it," Miss Marple said, her voice cold and final. "But the truth always comes to light, no matter how hard people try to bury it." Merton stood up abruptly, his face contorted with fury. "You don't know anything. You can't prove a thing." Before anyone could react, Merton lunged toward the door, his hand reaching for the handle. But the police were already there, blocking his escape. He froze, realizing the futility of his actions. "Get him," Miss Marple ordered softly, and the officers moved swiftly, restraining Merton with ease. Mrs. Lambert had been silent throughout the exchange, her face pale and drawn. When Miss Marple turned to her, the older woman finally spoke, her voice breaking. "I didn't mean for it to go this far. I never wanted to hurt anyone. But we couldn't let him find out. It would have destroyed everything." Miss Marple's gaze softened. "You let your fear control you. You let the past destroy you instead of letting go of it. And now the truth has come to light." Mrs. Lambert's eyes filled with tears as she looked down, unable to meet Miss Marple's gaze. "I'm sorry. I never meant for any of this to happen." The final pieces of the puzzle had fallen into place, and the case was solved. Sir Edwin's death, which had once seemed like an unsolvable mystery, was now fully understood. Mrs. Lambert and Geoffrey Merton, driven by their own fears, secrets and greed, had done the unthinkable to protect themselves from the past. As the officers led them away, Miss Marple allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. The puzzle had been solved, the trap had been set perfectly, and justice would be served. As the police led Geoffrey Merton and Mrs. Lambert out of the room, Miss Marple remained still, her gaze fixed on the doorway through which they had exited. For a brief moment, she allowed herself to feel the weight of the case lifting. The puzzle, which had seemed so insurmountable just days ago, had finally been solved. Sir Edwin's murder was no longer a mystery. It was a carefully calculated act of desperation, driven by fear and a past that refused to stay buried. But then, as she stood there in the dimly lit room, something shifted. A quiet unease settled over her, as though the threads of the case weren't quite as tightly woven as they seemed. She had seen this before, that subtle sense that something was still lurking, hidden just out of sight. She wasn't ready to declare victory just yet. She turned to Detective Harris, who had been silently observing the scene. He gave her a nod, as though sensing her discomfort. "Miss Marple?" he asked softly, his voice tinged with uncertainty. "Is it over?" Miss Marple hesitated. There was a nagging feeling in her gut, one that refused to be ignored. She'd been wrong before, dismissing small details, convinced they were nothing more than distractions. But in her experience, the truth had a way of revealing itself when least expected. "No," she said quietly, her voice betraying none of the doubt she felt. "It's not over yet." Detective Harris frowned. "What do you mean?" "We've caught the killers, Miss Marple. We have the evidence." Miss Marple held up a hand, silencing him. "There's something else. Something we've missed." Harris looked at her, bewildered. "But the motive, the opportunity, the confession, it all fits. Mrs. Lambert, Merton, they were working together. They killed Sir Edwin. We have them." "I'm aware of that," Miss Marple replied, her voice steady, though there was a flicker of concern in her eyes. "But there's still one piece that doesn't add up." She took a step toward the window, looking out at the night sky. The stars were distant and cold, much like the feelings she was beginning to recognize within herself. She had been so focused on the obvious, on the motives of Mrs. Lambert and Merton, that she had overlooked something far more subtle. A pattern, perhaps, or a subtle clue that didn't quite fit the rest. Turning back to Harris, she fixed him with a sharp look. "You were here when the body was found, correct?" He nodded, his brow furrowing in confusion. "Yes, you know I was. We've been over this a dozen times." "Did anyone else have access to the study, to the scene of the crime?" she asked. Harris thought for a moment, his expression growing more serious. "There were several people who could have had access, of course. But we already know that Merton and Lambert were in the area at the time of Sir Edwin's death." Miss Marple shook her head slowly. "It's not about who had access. It's about who could have manipulated the evidence." "Manipulated the evidence?" Harris echoed, clearly puzzled. Miss Marple took a deep breath. The realization hit her with the force of a sudden storm, and the pieces clicked together in her mind with unnerving clarity. "Think about it," she said, her voice low and deliberate. "The letter that Sir Edwin received, the one he was going to confront Mrs. Lambert about. Who had the opportunity to find that letter before it reached him?" The detective's eyes widened in realization, but he still hesitated. "You think it was someone else, someone who wasn't in the house when the murder took place?" Miss Marple nodded slowly, the implications of her thoughts starting to form into something more coherent. "Exactly. I believe someone else was involved, someone whose presence we never considered." A chill ran down Harris's spine as the pieces began to fall into place, but he still struggled to follow her logic. "Who, Miss Marple? Who are you suggesting?" Her gaze moved across the room as if scanning the very walls for the answers. Her mind was racing now, the truth creeping up on her like a shadow, something that had been just beneath the surface all along. It's someone who would have known about the affair, about the secret Sir Edwin was about to reveal. Someone who stands to gain far more from Sir Edwin's death than we've realized. The words hung in the air, and for a moment Harris stared at her, his thoughts racing. And then, like a flash of lightning, it hit him. "The woman in the portrait," he said quietly, as the revelation slowly dawned on him. Lady Edith, Sir Edwin's mother. She was never far from the picture, was she? We were all so focused on the living, we never considered the dead. Miss Marple gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. Precisely. The entire room seemed to hold its breath as the detective's mind raced to catch up. Lady Edith, sir. Edwin's late mother had been the one to uncover the truth about Sir Edwin's father, the one who had kept the secret of the affair locked away for years. But there was more to it than that. Sir Edwin had found the evidence. He had found the final piece that tied the whole family's scandal together. A secret that, once revealed, would have destroyed not just Mrs. Lambert and Merton, but everyone involved. "The letter," Miss Marple said, her voice firm. It wasn't Mrs. Lambert who feared its contents. It was someone else. Someone who had already lost everything once because of the past, and feared it would happen again. She turned sharply, meeting Harris's gaze with startling intensity. "Lady Edith. She's the one who wanted Sir Edwin dead. She couldn't let the past come to light. But she had to cover her tracks. That's why she planted the letter. That's why she manipulated Merton and Mrs. Lambert into doing the dirty work for her. They were pawns in her game." The room seemed to spin for a moment as Harris took it all in. It made sense now. The motive, the deception, the manipulation, all of it pointed back to Lady Edith, the woman who had spent years in the shadows, watching as her past came back to haunt her. But the twist, the true depth of the conspiracy, wasn't fully clear until Miss Marple spoke the final, chilling words. Lady Edith didn't just want Sir Edwin dead. She wanted him erased from history. And now we need to find her before it's too late. As the realization set in, the detective's stomach dropped. What began as a straightforward murder investigation had evolved into something far darker. And Miss Marple, with her unwavering brilliance, had found the true mastermind. The hunt for Lady Edith had begun, but the trail was already growing cold. The small family estate where she had lived in relative seclusion for years had been deserted. No signs of forced entry, no personal effects left behind, nothing. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, slipping away in the dead of night, leaving only a sense of unease behind. Miss Marple stood by the window of the study, staring out at the sprawling grounds beyond, her mind working in overdrive. Detective Harris paced behind her, frustration etched on his face. He had hoped to find her here, but Lady Edith had already made her escape. "How could we have missed her?" Harris muttered to himself, rubbing his forehead in exasperation. "We were so close, everything pointed to her. How did she manage to slip away?" Miss Marple's lips twitched into a faint smile, the kind she reserved for moments like this, when the detective was on the verge of an answer, but hadn't yet connected all the dots. "She didn't slip away, Detective," Miss Marple said softly, her voice steady. "She planned this escape carefully. We were never meant to find her, not so soon." Harris stopped pacing and turned to her, eyes narrowing in frustration. "What do you mean?" "We've been thorough. The estate is empty. There's nothing here." "No," Miss Marple replied. "There's something here, but it's been hidden in plain sight. The whole time we've been so focused on the obvious, on the people who were closest to Sir Edwin, Merton, Mrs. Lambert, that we overlooked the key to the whole puzzle." Harris's brow furrowed. "You're saying there's something we missed here?" Miss Marple nodded. her eyes glinting with the quiet confidence that had guided her through countless mysteries. The answer was never in the suspects themselves. Detective. It was in the way they were all manipulated. She turned from the window, facing him directly. Lady Edith wasn't just hiding from us, she was hiding in plain sight all along. Harris blinked in confusion, not sure where she was going with this. What do you mean? How could she have hidden here, in her own home? Miss Marple's gaze remained sharp, her eyes piercing the air as though pulling the answer out of the very room. Lady Edith knew that the key to the entire plot was the letter that Sir Edwin received, the one he was about to confront her about. That was the turning point. But what we failed to see was the significance of the timing, how it all tied back to the very moment Sir Edwin was killed. She paused, allowing her words to sink in. Harris's mind was racing, piecing together the timeline she had just laid out. The letter, the confrontation, the murder. Something wasn't right about the sequence of events. Miss Marple's gaze shifted toward the mantelpiece, where a single photograph of Sir Edwin and Lady Edith, both younger, hung on the wall. Lady Edith had one final card to play, detective. She knew that if Sir Edwin revealed the truth about the affair, it would be the end of her. The past would come rushing back, and she would lose everything she had worked so hard to bury. Harris's eyes widened in realization. You mean she manipulated everything? The murder, the witnesses, the evidence, all of it was part of her plan? Yes, Miss Marple confirmed. She didn't just want Sir Edwin dead, she wanted to control how the truth was told. She didn't want it to come out through any public scandal. She wanted to silence him before he could expose the truth. And she used others to do it, Mrs. Lambert, Merton, even the butler. But where did she go? Harris asked, his voice strained. If she's the mastermind, why leave now? Miss Marple glanced down at the desk, where a small, inconspicuous object rested, an old, faded key. Because she knew we were getting closer. This key was the last thing she left behind. It leads to an old storage room in the estate, where she kept a set of personal journals. She was always meticulous about keeping the past locked away, but she also knew it wouldn't be long before we put everything together. Harris snatched the key from the desk, his fingers trembling slightly as he examined it. So, she didn't just disappear. She's hiding something. Miss Marple nodded, her voice almost a whisper. And if we can get to those journals, we'll have the final proof. The one thing that ties her to the murder. But I fear that by the time we reach her, it may be too late. The tension in the room was palpable as Miss Marple's words hung in the air. Harris was already turning toward the door, the urgency of the moment pulling at him. But Miss Marple's voice stopped him before he could leave. Detective, she said quietly. One last thing. The journals you're looking for. She hid. Them, yes. But there's one more thing I'd like you to remember. It's the same thing I told you from the beginning. Harris turned back to her, confusion still clouding his thoughts. What do you mean? Miss Marple gave him a faint, knowing smile. The truth doesn't always come to light the way we expect it to. Sometimes it's hidden in plain sight. Sometimes the one we think is guilty has already slipped through our fingers. Harris was about to speak when a sharp knock at the door interrupted him. A uniformed officer entered, his face grave. Detective, we've found her. Lady Edith, she's gone. For a brief, agonizing moment, Miss Marple and Harris exchanged a look of quiet understanding. Despite everything, despite the evidence, despite the truth, they had lost her. "We're too late," Harris muttered. Miss Marple remained silent, her eyes distant, as though seeing a greater truth just beyond her reach. The case was far from over. Lady Edith had escaped, but the damage had been done. Her carefully laid plans had unraveled, and though the truth was now clear to those who could see it, it would never be fully acknowledged. She had slipped away, just as she always intended to, and so, in the final hours, justice was left to chase shadows, forever out of reach. The criminal mastermind had been exposed, but the world would never know the full depth of her crime. As the door closed behind the officer, Miss Marple turned to the window once more. "In the end, detective, sometimes the truth is all that remains. But justice, much like time, is a far more elusive thing." As the last of the officers filed out of the study, closing the door behind them with a soft click, a heavy silence settled over the room. Detective Harris lingered by the door, staring at the darkened hallway outside, his mind racing. The case was far from what he had expected. It had turned from a straightforward investigation into something far more complex, more tangled than he could have anticipated. Miss Marple, still standing by the window, looked out at the gardens bathed in the last golden hues of the setting sun. Her expression was thoughtful, distant, as though the mysteries of the day had already begun to fade into the background of her mind, already replaced by the shadow of another, waiting. "I suppose you think I'm disappointed, detective," she said, her voice soft yet steady, breaking the silence that had enveloped them both. Harris turned, surprised at the calm in her tone. "Disappointed? You've solved it, Miss Marple. You were right all along. Lady Edith played us from the start. She's gone. There's no more chasing her down now." "I'm not disappointed in the outcome," Miss Marple replied. "I'm simply aware of the subtle truths that we missed. That's what often happens with these cases, the ones where we think the story has ended but we forget to look one last time. The small details that we thought were insignificant. They're the ones that always keep us awake at night." Her words resonated with him. Harris had seen it before. The cases where the answers were too clear, where the puzzle seemed too perfectly assembled. And yet the sense of unease, that nagging feeling that something wasn't quite right, lingered. In this case, he had allowed himself to believe that the disappearance of Lady Edith marked the end of the story, but Miss Marple was right. Something else had to be hidden in the shadows, something that wasn't finished just yet. "I don't understand," Harris said, walking toward the desk where the evidence was laid out. "We've tied everything together. Lady Edith, the murder, the motive. Everything points to her being the mastermind. We have the proof. So why does it feel like we've missed something?" Miss Marple turned toward him, her eyes sharp and knowing. "The way we look at things often blinds us to what is really happening. We think of Lady Edith as the central figure, and yes, she was. But she wasn't the only one involved. We're forgetting the most important clue, the one that never quite fit. Remember the way Sir Edwin died?" Harris froze, an uneasy shiver creeping up his spine. He had gone over the details of the murder a dozen times, yet something in Miss Marple's words sparked a new line of thought. "The poison," he muttered to himself. "It wasn't in his drink. It was on the cufflinks. He must have touched them." "Exactly," she interrupted. "Sir Edwin's death was not just a crime of passion or greed. It was calculated. The cufflinks were the key, detective. But more than that, who would have known how to use them? Who would have known that Sir Edwin would wear those cufflinks that day? Harris's mind was working furiously, the pieces of the puzzle beginning to shift in his head. But Lady Edith wouldn't have had access to them in that way, not so easily. There were too many people involved. The butler, Merton, Mrs. Lambert. They were all part of it, but none of them could have made it happen without someone else pulling the strings. Miss Marple smiled, though there was a quiet sadness to it. Sometimes the most complicated conspiracies are the simplest at their core. Perhaps you've been looking for a villain when the answer was right in front of you all along. A new realization hit him so fast it almost knocked the breath out of him. The sudden twist was as sharp and unsettling as a blade. No, it couldn't be. It's too obvious. Too simple. Is it? Miss Marple's voice held a note of both certainty and warning. The one person who never stood out, who was always just there, quietly observing. Often the key players are the ones we least suspect. The detective's heart skipped a beat, and a cold chill ran down his spine. He turned, reaching for his coat, his mind reeling as the connections clicked into place. I need to make a call. But just as his hand grasped the phone, a soft knock on the door interrupted him. He looked up, his tension palpable. The door creaked open, and a young officer entered, holding an envelope. Detective, this just arrived. It was addressed to you. No return address. Harris took the envelope, ripping it open with a sense of urgency. Inside was a single sheet of paper, hastily scrawled with ink. His eyes flicked over the note, a frown forming as he read. You think you've solved everything, but there's one more thing. Look beyond the obvious. Follow the truth wherever it leads. Only then will you see the entire picture. E. The initials E. He knew who that was. The implications were impossible to ignore. He turned to Miss Marple, who had already seen the note and was standing motionless. Her expression was unreadable, but the look in her eyes told him everything. They were not finished. Not yet. Harris was about to speak when another officer entered, his face pale. Detective, you need to see this. The officer handed him another report, this one more alarming than anything they had encountered before. We've found something new, something from the past. A case we didn't even know was connected. It's a different murder, one that happened years ago, linked to the same family. Harris could barely comprehend the magnitude of what he was hearing, but Miss Marple was already moving, her mind working faster than anyone else's. Another mystery, she said softly, one that has waited a long time to be uncovered. It seems, Detective, that the story never truly ends, does it? As the weight of the revelation settled over him, Harris felt a sense of foreboding. The case wasn't over. It had never been over. The villain had not only escaped justice, they had laid the groundwork for something darker still. And as Miss Marple stepped toward the door, preparing for the next challenge, Harris couldn't help but wonder if they had just uncovered the first thread in an entirely new web of lies. One thing was certain, their work was far from finished. The true mystery had only just begun.